Welcome to the Counterweight Podcast. I am Doug Rogers, Chief Revenue Officer and Managing Partner for Waypoint Healthcare Solutions. And I'm joined weekly by my co-host, James Kanary, founder and owner of the Upper Right Corner. Together, we are focused on speaking to and learning from growth leaders across the healthcare space about their journeys and lessons learned. James and I want to explore how growth leaders manage this tension not only for their teams, but also with their leaders and in many cases, board members and investors. We will discuss with our guests the career journey they have been on, key influences that help them put them into the position they are today. We will talk about successes and challenges, what they learned from these events for themselves and for their teams. Join us each week for a new episode with our guest. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn under the name The Counterweight Podcast. Subscribe, like, follow, and give us feedback as we go along. Now on to the show. Welcome to the Counterweight Podcast. I am joined by my co-host, James Kanary. I'm Doug Rogers, and I am super excited to welcome Rhys Gay. I said it slowly, so I didn't take away his joke, which I'm sure he's going to tell us later. But Rhys is joining
tell
us.
It right now. It's,
okay.
It's Rhys Gay.
If you say it fast, if you say it fast enough, it is risque. So that holds.
Yeah, you are risque. This is
risque.
risque move.
That's right.
Well, on the show.
That's the disclaimer for the rest of the episode. We're gonna venture into some.
If you have small children in your vehicle, remove them now.
Yeah. So Rhys, I feel bad as a co-host. I've already taken us off onto a tangent. I've not kept us into a structured lane to hit the high points. So I'm gonna bring us back.
Yeah.
And let's just start with telling our listeners a little bit about where you are these days, what you're doing. Good. And then we're going to dive into the rest of the exciting content that we've got.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So risque. So I have the pleasure of running the U.S. business at Butterfly Network. So Butterfly is the world's largest handheld ultrasound company. So we actually have a device that plugs into your iPhone or your Android, but it actually has a whole body ultrasound. So instead of needing a full cart, you can actually plug it in and scan a whole body. So from lungs to babies to hearts, all from a single device. And the big thing here is we've actually digitized the way to produce an ultrasound. So you no longer need multiple devices. You actually are able to, from a single head, we've actually developed a microchip that emits the sound waves. And so we can digitally bend the sound based on your use case. So we're seeing a huge proliferation of ultrasound. We actually just released our third generation device, but our second generation, which is still on the market, is actually the number one selling ultrasound handheld of all time. So it's really, really great. Really exciting time to be here. But yeah, I have responsibility for not only U.S. sales, which is both direct and inside sales. We actually have a federal channel, distribution, and then also lead our client success side of the business as well.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I love hearing about the journey and the success that Butterfly has been on, the science behind that, which we're not going to get into because none of the three of us are qualified to speak to, but it does sound fairly phenomenal, the capabilities that you can put into a device of that nature. So pretty amazing stuff. Let's start though and take a journey back. So right now you're leading all of US sales for Butterfly Network, which is a publicly traded company. We're going to touch on that in here a little bit later because there are some unique dynamics in publicly traded versus privately held companies. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how and why you got into sales to begin with?
Well, actually, yeah. So we'll take a step back. So my father actually was always in sales of some form or capacity. But it was very simple sales. It was, he has an agricultural degree from Oklahoma State University. So it was things like working for co-ops or selling feed bags or doing that kind of, he was a general manager of a garage door depot at one point. It was very simple type sales. And in those type of organizations, and that type of industry, as soon as the market goes down, the first thing they do is lay off their sales force. And so I was actually very resistant to be in a sales capacity. And so when I was at Cerner, my first 2 years, I was actually in the ambulatory division PowerWorks doing support for ambulatory practices, specifically the billing side. And they were like, look, you keep pushing us a lot of leads. You keep doing all this type of work, and like, we're getting a lot of opportunity out of here. Would you be interested in being an inside salesperson? And I was like, yeah, maybe. And actually James, I had some counsel from James at the time. He was like, actually, instead of just doing inside sales, like what your skills are, you might actually want to go through the full client representative program at Cerner. And
terrible
so
idea.
worst idea ever. And so, but it was funny, what he didn't know at the time, I was actually kind of at a crossroads. So whenever I was at Oklahoma State, I was actually the mascot at Oklahoma State. I was Pistol Pete, Division I All-American, not a big deal.
You wore the big head, and
Can you give us the little Pistol Pete motion for those?
So the kicker here is you have to do this and kick at the same side. So you kick as you throw up your email.
Could you please stand up and demonstrate for our audience? Important.
And for those watching, we are going to put up a picture of the mascot. If you're not familiar with Pistol Pete, this is your chance to become familiar.
Yeah.
And which conference is Pistol Pete in now? I lost track.
In the Big 12. In the Big 12. Yes, that's right.
The Big 12. Does that still exist? I thought that conference dissolved. Because it's all pretty much Big 10 and SEC now, as I understand it.
The ones that are in those conferences, that's all they care about. But that's fine. Anyways, but no. So what was funny though is when I was in support at Cerner, I actually wanted to get away from my desk as much as possible. Like, I love helping people, but that's just a brutal job. And so being at Cerner, there's a weird kind of a mascot tied to this. They had actually launched a mascot. I don't know if you guys remember Ping, the big ball that would run around. Well, Neil Patterson's daughter.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, Neil Patterson's daughter, Lindsay, found out that I was Pistol Pete, that I was there, and I got to do it at a couple CHCs and a couple town halls. And while I was there, they brought in Slugger and they brought in Casey Wolf and all that. Well, the guy that was Slugger turned to me and goes, "Hey, I'm looking for a backup for events. Would you like to do that, a way to supplement your income?" Because we were talking about being in support.
Because you were so good. You were so good at being Ping.
Yeah,
right?
a big ball running around with your hands like this.
Research. We also need to look for a picture of Ping if there are any out there.
I'm sure I can find
They
one.
may have been removed from the internet by the branding team. But I also would challenge, if anyone knows where the Ping mascot uniform is, or whatever you call it.
It's a character. It's not a uniform. You're not saluting. It's not a costume. It's not Halloween. It's not a suit. You're not going to church. It's a character. Come on now.
It's a character. So if anyone knows where the Ping character is, we would like to find it, and we'd like to maybe have a charity auction for it or something. I don't know. We could do something cool. All right.
We'll figure.
Keep going,
but anyway,
but so much fun.
But anyways, yeah. So I was at a crossroads because what happened is I actually went and did a formal interview at Kaufman in the actual executive suite to actually talk about being a backup for Slugger. And at the same time, unbeknownst to me, I guess there was a lawsuit going on where the guy that was trying to get me to be his backup had shot a hot dog gun off, and it hit someone in the face, and it scratched their cornea. And part of that lawsuit was the guy couldn't be Slugger anymore. So they turned to me and they were like, "Hey, do you want to be Slugger full time?" So I actually had to make a decision if I wanted to be a Major League Baseball mascot or I wanted to grow up and be a real boy and go off and actually, start my career in sales.
You would have done great no matter what you did. I remember this conversation.
Yeah.
That you had gotten the offer, and you asked me what I thought you should do, and I didn't want to crush your dreams, but like in my head, I'm going, I know where the ceiling is on being a professional sports mascot. I have a pretty good feeling. I know where that ceiling is, and you would have hit it pretty quickly. And in my mind, I'm going, you're going to kill it at sales. And yet well, you tell me, was I helpful in my answer? You ended up going into sales.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Well, I ended up doing, because mind you, the struggle, right? Cause like this was 15 years ago. So I think my base salary was like in the low 40s coming into it. It was going to go up slightly going into the CR program, but like, it was like another 15 to 20K increase taking that job straight out the gate. So it was an immediate bump into that, not 6 months of being in class and then the potential opportunity of making more money and actually making a career. And so, yeah, no, I think you do a really good job, James, of every time I've ever had a crossroads, it's always been like, are you running away from something? Are you running towards something, right? Like, what is that actually doing for you? What is the long-term implication? And actually, one of the things you said to me, and I think you've said it to me countless times, is like, of the one thing that you gave up, if your worst enemy took that, what would you be more upset about? Like if they did it and they were successful, what would you be more upset about? And the actual answer was, actually having a long-term career and actually growing up and those things. But my dad reinforced it by being like, son, you don't understand the industry that you're in. Everything I was in was very simple stuff. It's very fluctuated. You're probably in one of the most insulated industries out there. The fact that you're on that crossroads of healthcare and technology, and that's not going away. And frankly, if he was afforded the type of opportunity that I had in front of me, our lives would have been different, right? It was just because his interests were agriculture, his interests were those things. And so it was just tied to that really I'm a derivative of my father and less hair, but that really to me resonated. And so it was somewhere between James's wise counsel and my father's don't be an idiot. Like you need to go do this is where I kind of landed into sales. And frankly, have never looked back, and the best decision.
So Rhys, I would just say for all our listeners, you do not have a face to be hidden behind a mascot head. Probably best decision that you decided to go down this path. I'm actually going to, oddly enough, James, I'm going to ask you this before we turn back to Rhys. And I really am fascinated about these choices that we hear people talk about. And in the moment, they probably feel big, but in hindsight, we only begin to realize the importance of those choices and the impacts that they have on the journey of our life. When you were having this conversation with Rhys, who was sitting in an ambulatory support role, so behind a screen, in an office, not out in front of clients, what were the things that you saw in him, the character traits, the personality traits, et cetera, that you felt you could lean in and say, you have a chance to be successful here versus something else?
Besides his face, that shouldn't be hidden behind a mascot.
That's
mask.
right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the Patrick Lencioni, and at the time I didn't even know who Patrick Lencioni was. And I don't think he had actually even written the Ultimate Team Player yet. But if you follow his writing and his teachings, humble, hungry, and smart. Humble, hungry, smart. I'll reach back here. That was our theme for our flag football team last year.
That's great.
And I think that's Rhys. I think Rhys exhibits those traits, those values, character values. And I saw that in him, and I thought, man, I would not want to see that potential wasted. And I think even though, you never have everything figured out, right? That's part of being humble, is that you're approachable, you're coachable, you're hungry for more. You wanted more in your career, and you were looking at, hey, wow, opportunity to earn more here. You were weighing those things out. So you weren't happy with the status quo. And then in the Lencioni model, smart really means smart with people. It's not actually like your IQ and your smarts about the industry. It's your
because Lord knows that's where I struggle. You always hire smarter people than yourself, right?
Yeah. Although for the flag football team, just to keep it simple, I told the players it was about knowing the playbook. But in our case, as leaders, it's really about, are you smart about your EQ and ability to connect? You have sort of the IQ to connect with people, which is really around, are you aware of your presence and your impact on others? And in the Lencioni book, which I highly recommend, by the way, Ultimate Team Player, talk about just the no jackass rule, right? And so there's not an ounce of jackass in you, Rhys. We would have seen it by now. And by the way, listeners, if you've seen it, please send in those stories to us about Rhys. We want to hear them.
Or videos of dance, or videos of
Yeah.
me dancing at CHC on stages and stuff. Those things.
Videos are encouraged, yes. But all that to say, I think that's what I saw in Rhys, and that has come to play out over the years, that he's been humble. He continues to be humble, hungry, smart.
Yeah.
Well, that's a different phrasing, but like one of the things I was reading an article the other day that was talking about, do you want to be a humble leader or do you want to be a narcissistic leader? And the answer was actually, you want to be a narcissist or humbly narcissistic or something like that is how it was worded. And the thought is you need to have a strong enough perspective to be able to drive and to challenge the adversity, but then having that humility to know when you're wrong, when to pivot, when to take the right, when to take the left, and the wisdom to know the difference between all of that. And so very kind of you to say, James. And I didn't pay him anything to say that as well, but I much appreciated.
Yeah, that is a wonderful compliment. And Rhys, I would turn back. So, I mean, obviously you have had a journey of success. So some of these things are known now, but as you made that transition, knowing that you had the building blocks, or at least people saw these building blocks within you, as you transitioned into both a training program and then ultimately went out into the field as an individual sales contributor, talk a little bit about the methodology, the tactics, the process that you learned that put yourself in a position of success. And I have to imagine it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine. I'm sure there were your fair share of either rejections or disappointment or challenges, et cetera. Yeah. But how did you go from, if you will, building blocks to a highly successful functioning individual sales rep as part of that transition?
I think all of us that ever went through the client rep program, and I think the way the Cerner did business writ large, was a huge step up because it created a foundation. So the way that I think about sales is very much in that model, right? It's knowing everything. And especially when you talk about enterprise selling, it's much different with an enterprise sale because really it's coalition building. And sometimes it's less about getting everybody to say yes than it is negating your detractors. But being smart enough to be able to have a discussion, or at least not necessarily know the answer, but know why they're asking the question. And I think that's where I really think I got a lot out of it, to where we know not necessarily the feature function of everything. That's why you have very specialists that come in and can talk through those things. But at least knowing what the problem is, why they're asking the question, being able to document it well enough to then be able to know at least the general value proposition of you in that situation. And then if they have a question or dig deeper, because it's also I think part of it is the art of when you're in those moments, being able to ask a good enough question that they can start spewing and filling in because they probably are smart about something, and then you just retaining what that is, even if you don't know what they're talking about, and then go figuring it out on the backside. I think the other thing that served me well was understanding that we're people first, that it really is drawing emotions out of people, and people really lead. They talk about, there's several sales models, but trust triangle is one of them. You have blue sheets, which we've done in the past. But when we talk about those things, it's really being able to build trust through confidence. I think part of that process too is always being what I call the 3 Ps: polished, prepared, and present. And so when we're talking, I'm actually engaged. I'm not fiddling on my phone, right? I think part of this too is us being polished. My shirts are always pressed, right? Those sorts of things, because you can build. I'm a person that always has led with trust. I will always do that to a fault, where until you give me a reason not to trust you, I start there. But a lot of people aren't that way. And so it really is just making sure that you give no one a reason not to be able to at least build trust, build confidence in what you're saying, having a perspective, and then being able to grow. But yeah, I think the difference coming out of training is they did a really good job of giving us all of that foundation to where we could be competent in all of those things, as well as to how to be professional. I remember, shout out to Randy Eggleston. He was our director that was running the program at the time. We were at a Royals game, and, I was just a 25, 26-year-old guy, went up to the thing, got a beer because we're all just hanging out. And he was like, "Where's mine?" And he goes, "Number one," and I was like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't get you one." And he was like, "Number one rule, always be prepared to be able to be giving to someone in a sales capacity, because ultimately you're kind of an orchestrator, and those sorts of things and stuff like that." That's minimal, but that's something that stuck with me, that not a lot of organizations, when they go build salespeople, take the time. It's usually like, "Oh, here's clinical education. Here's how you position our product," but not actually taking the time to help you understand how to be a good professional in those. But what I learned coming out of there is that coalition build is really just about people building. And if you actually go into these situations with a servant's heart, with that humility that James spoke about, wanting to educate them on something, look, I'm not here to sell you anything. You actually end up selling quite a bit, because at the end of the day, if they have a question, you answer it. If they have a problem, you answer it, but your answer is always going to be in the perspective of your institution that you're working with, or the product that you have, because that is your perspective. And a lot of times people will just press the easy button. I mean, that's why consultative selling is so powerful in, doing these facility type walkthroughs and approaching people that way, because you're able to highlight their problem, because they want you to, you might have some data that they don't know about. They want you to expand upon it. And then when you come back and be like, "Yeah, here's the actual extent of it. This is how I would solve it." More times than not, they could take your idea and go do it elsewhere or try to do it themselves. But more times than not, we're busy. People are willing to at least, press that easy button and say, "Okay, I appreciate your perspective. There is value in this. Speed to value in what you're doing." And frankly, that's that mixed with the fact that I jumped in right at the beginning of, I had about 6 months of pre-meaningful use. And so I got the really tough old school Cerner selling, and then the backside there. But even that pre-meaningful use, when it was coming but not there, we actually did a cold call to close with just that perspective of just loving people, education, in 82 days. And at that time, that was the quickest single footprint that Cerner had ever done. And now, granted, through meaningful use, through critical access, I think I got it down to like sub 30. It was like 27 or 28 days of like walking in, hello, and then closing. But that's a whole different time. That would never have, selling a $3 million transaction in sub 30 days. But really what that came down to was building your coalition, just negating your detractors. And when you talk to people, you're literally just trying to educate. And then as a byproduct, and that, let's be frank, we all are motivated by dollars and providing for our families and that kind of stuff. But for me, that's important. I want the value from what I'm performing and what I'm doing, but that's not what gets me out of bed. It's making sure that whatever vision or perspective that I have, that I project it. Like that is the thing that gets me from day to day, which allows for you to be in the educator mindset and growing other people with your perspective, evangelical, if you will. To be able to go preach that gospel of whatever you're doing, has always, I think, led to my benefit and success. Which I will say, I've never won an of the year. I want to be very clear. I've never won an of the year of anything, right? So I was never number one in anything, but I was always number 2 or number 3 consistently. Because you always have those people that go up one year and they close their pipeline, and then they're down at 5 or 6, 7 in the pack. I think I have like 600% club trophy little thing plaques over here for like 6 years in a row. And I was like second place every single year, which is okay.
All right. We're going to change that. We're doing a counterweight guest of the year. Yeah. So you're in the running. We'll have to see how the voting goes.
In the running.
You're in the top 10.
Actually, showing up in mascot costume would probably put you in the lead.
That would definitely put you toward the top. And if you do work in the Pistol Pete kick before the end of this podcast, I feel like that's going to rocket you up to the top. Just saying.
Yeah. I'll see, but I don't have my chaps on, so it really isn't effective because normally when you kick, the reason you kick is it has some flair to it.
I'm glad to hear you don't have your chaps on. There's just a lot that I need to unpack there. So let's go back to some of the things you talked about: polished, prepared, and present. And by the way, just those things like, and I mean, this is not a basic sales training conversation, but I do think some of this gets lost out there. And how much should we guide people on this? And I mean, I think people are obviously responsible for how they show up.
Yeah.
So the piece about Randy, hey, where's my right? First of all, that's a great way to get a free beer. Is just claim that you're doing sales training. So good strategy.
Good on him. Good on him.
Next time if you're like, where's mine? Where's my coffee? Where's my latte? So good. But I think just being in the servant mentality, right? When you're thinking about others first, you're thinking about your client first. You're putting yourself in their shoes rather than making it about you. And you're building relational capital, right? It's not about driving an agenda. It's not about closing the deal, although yes, we're measured on that. It's about the relationship and it's about building trust. So I think you just had a lot of really good nuggets in there. And I hope that our audience has been able to grab hold of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Rhys, I'm gonna fast forward you just a little bit.
Yeah.
And you made a great observation, which is you came out of training, you had building blocks, it reinforced those building blocks, gave you some new tools to work with, and then you entered into a market, and that market changed somewhat to everyone's benefit. But that's not a predication for success. Just because macro things are working in your favor doesn't mean that you are guaranteed success. You still have to work very hard to navigate that. But during that journey, as I understand it, you transitioned into a leadership role while you were in that team because you were focused on the small market community works, so critical access hospitals, community hospitals, et cetera, across the United States. Talk to us a little bit about both what you did as an individual contributor, and then as you moved into a leadership role, what were the things that you looked for in team members? And to be fair, I'd like you to break this apart. They're the characteristics, the attributes, humble, smart, that we heard James talk about, but touch on just a little bit mechanically. What did you expect of your team members that set them up for success when they were a part of your group?
Yeah. So I like how you talked about the transition in the market. So when you look at rural America, and specifically rural healthcare, they're like 10 years behind the rest of the majority of the healthcare industry as just a factor. I mean, it's just how it is, right? They're never the bleeding edge. They're early adopters. They're always going to be in that laggard category. And actually, what's funny is once meaningful use actually kicked off, I actually saw a huge dip in business. And the reason why is the two that had done it before did it not because of meaningful use, but because they needed to go do it. And so I actually, within my first 6 months of being in the role, I sold 2 footprints. It was almost like $10 million worth of business in the course of 6 months. And then the entire next full year, I went goose egg. But I was doing all the right inputs. And so I think that's part of when I look at people, it's that grit that are focusing on their inputs that can actually be very cognizant about, look, and with any team, as long as you're doing the right inputs, the outputs will always come and it will always follow. Because then after that, I went on a hot streak. I think within the next 18 months, it was like 7 or 8 footprints, which was like unprecedented for being able to go through that. And like Texas, for example, where a lot of this happened, we went in 5-6 years, we went from nothing to almost 20 footprints, both as an individual contributor and as a leader. But we had to get through that transition of where the market was. And sometimes when things are out of your control and it's truly market-based, that grit of understanding the right process and having faith in that audacity and I forget what I said. There was like the narcissistic kind of like, I know this works. I know this is a thing, and sticking to it is really big. But yeah, no, as you build a team, I mean, I had the pleasure of, at the time, I had a really great mentor, and he was a manager, Michael Farrell. And, Michael taught me a couple things. One, really getting in with your hands, like being in front of people is everything. I mean, we always kind of joked, like, I don't know, end of quarter. And that was part of it too. It's like always figuring out a way to build pressure, end of quarters, all of that stuff, but making it relevant, because people don't care if you're publicly traded or if you have a quarter, but it's people that are always willing to be able to build that type of enthusiasm and subsequently deadlines, and then smart enough to know, okay, if you want to be here, I need to back you into it. But when it comes down to the people that I look for, because mind you, they just spoon fed us people that at least knew, just like I did at that time, spoon fed all of the you didn't really have to do onboarding or training. That's what they got for you. You then had to pick out which ones would align best to you as a leader, and then be able to really draw out the best in them. And when I looked at the people that were successful and the way that I built my teams and the way that I still do this today, by the end, we had 3 or 4 different leaders, and you could really tell the differences of the teams, or based on engaging with a person, who their leader was. And I think because your team is always going to be a reflection of you, which really taught me that it's about the actual, because you can teach people new tricks. You can teach them about this product or that product. What you can't really change is who they are. And the people that haven't really worked well with me, it's because, values are a real thing here. And it's like being able to understand that, right? Tolerance for pain, tolerance for change, all of those things that built out. But one of the things that I've really found that's been a driver is, the concept, I think that humility is big, James. I think when you talk about even Dick Flanagan with the whole be a student, that comes with humility, right? Which is really big. One thing I have learned is not everybody has to read books and do the IQ stuff, right, to be successful. And frankly, a lot of individual contributors just want to be individual contributors and aren't wanting to, elevate within the organization. They're happy doing that job. And so they don't need to read a book on, esoterically, whatever it is. But that being said, I think that ownership is really big, and being an owner, having that entrepreneurial spirit, because, anybody who's ever owned anything, right? Owners, they don't work 40 hours a week because they're so invested in what they're doing, and not only their brand, but what they're doing, their perspective. And that will put them in a situation that if they can own it, that will really want them to build, drive, develop relationships. And then if you can reinforce it, like I said before, leading with trust, they're going to be hardworking. And one of the things that's really served me well, especially once I got into leadership, is I would, like, if someone brings me a problem, we always say kill a snake. And that was a big thing, is like oppose, propose. If you don't like something, propose the problem. If you see a problem, kill a problem. Mm-hmm. But when people come to me and ask me questions, 90% of the time I ask, well, what's the right answer? And in my current world, what's the butterfly answer? What's the right answer to the client? Judge, executioner, jury, what is the right answer? Like, what do we need to do here? And let's go support that, because that's what will serve you well over time. And I think people that have the wisdom and the drive to want to go do that is really the delineation that'll delineate them as a thing. But that humility breeds consistency. And I think the other thing here is when I've built teams and then people that I want to bring onto teams, to be consistent with that humility, you really have to also not just be humble, but then also have the honesty to yourself and the willingness to evolve when you do find something that doesn't work, or something, early in my career, you can't tell I'm enthusiastic. I like people. But one of the things early in my career, I was told I stand too close to people sometimes when I talk. So I'm very cognizant from an emotional intelligence to step back and not really crowd people in. that hurt me because I just love people. But I realized that my willingness to evolve was more important, and it served me better in those. But I think where that really comes into play is when people always talk about consistency and someone talks about how to win, what's the first thing they talk about? How they won, right? And that's not it. It's a complete inverse, especially in, Butterfly is not a big organization. And no organization has infinite resources to begin with. But to me, it's always sharing your failures, sharing your resources, and being willing to cross-pollinate with those resources. And then lastly, selling and sharing your success, because ultimately it's what did you learn? And we actually have a weekly call with our whole sales organization, and we have, winnings and learnings, right? So let's absolutely celebrate our wins. Hey, you got this deal in this week, you did that. But then the next one is, what did you learn this week? And it's not always I learned and I have an answer for it, or I learned, but I'm not going to do this again. So then everybody can collectively grow together. And that to me kind of is that coupled with the last piece, which is finding something that will motivate. And a lot of times it's not intrinsic to dollars. I remember my last year as a sales leader within Community Works, I had set a statement at the beginning of the year that I personally, not expensed, anybody who sold a footprint, so actually signed up, brought a health system discerner that year, would get to come to this big steak dinner that I was going to host. And I was personally going to host this dinner, right? And so at the time, I think I had 6 or 7 client executives on my team. And we actually, halfway through the year, added a new person to the team that came directly out of the client rep program. And the proudest moment I ever had in leadership at Cerner was that year, because every single person on my team sold a footprint. And it was funny. It was like December 26th, day after Christmas. That guy that had joined the team had already sold a footprint in November or something like that, like pre-Christmas. And I had this wonderful, wonderful lady on my team, and we're at this hospital in Washington, and she's like, I just got to get to that dinner. I can't be the one to get hung out to dry. I have to get to that dinner. And it was funny because then we really created a family. And I think part of that too is that making sure that your team is competitive, but not cutthroat, right? She wasn't angry at the rest of them. She was proud of that they succeeded, right? But she wasn't cutthroat in the sense that she didn't want them to lose so she could win. And it really kind of brought that to my attention, that part of that team building and success of holistic teams is really being supportive and understanding of one another, and then creating that culture of accountability.
Man, I love that. So did you take your team to Golden Corral too, like Doug did? Or was that, because that counts as a steak dinner, right?
Still do.
Yeah. Well, first it does. Yeah. The ribs are excellent, and it's all you can eat dessert. So, have that in it. So
just help yourselves, team.
I'm going there for lunch. I don't know what the funny thing is about this.
Man, there's so much to unpack there, dude. I love the enthusiasm and the vibe. I mean, it's just so present in how you talk about it. I can tell that you're living it. Your team you're right in it. So, I mean, I heard humility, ownership mentality. So that sort of problem solving, killing the snake kind of stuff, like take care of it, trust, consistency, honesty. I mean, these are non-negotiables, right? As far as being on a team and being a high performing team, but man, just actually following through, right? Living it out. Adaptability, finding what motivates people. Yeah. Man, love that.
But to me, part of this, so the difference here is everybody always has these buzzwords, right? And what I've always struggled with is when I've been a part of organizations or on teams where it's like, here's what we live by, but it's really just leadership pushing it down. What we try to do in my current role and with the current organization is really at Butterfly, we're trying to, hold each other accountable. Obviously, there's a leadership component to it, but I've had situations where like I'm on back-to-back meetings a lot, right? And I'm very crunched most of my day. And I've had people be like, look, you were a couple minutes late. I can't have you be late, right? And it's okay. Like I also have that humility that it also goes up. There's an accountability to leadership and having the right also leaders. And then especially in my first really role now where I'm leading leaders, ensuring that they know that that is naturally a good part of the process for them to be also held accountable by their teams too.
Yeah, you're actually living it out, right? Because people will, if they're just words and the leadership is not living by those and there's not actions that align, then people, see through that. So I think that's super important. I want to talk about, you touched on sort of, you didn't use this word, but I sense it's like, hey, we're celebrating our wins, but we're also celebrating our losses in the sense of you called them learnings. So it's like your wins and your learnings. So talk about failure. How do you handle that? How do you learn from it? What types of culture you're creating around that so that the team can move forward and learn from that? So just talk a little bit more about failure and how you deal with that. And then in this industry, right, the expectations are very high. They're often, challenging, and in some cases there may be misalignment with the goal and what's reality. So how do you handle that challenge, and then how do you deal with failure?
Yeah, so I think I've never lost, is what I always try to say. I just think someone else is giving their money to somebody else at this time, but I'll eventually get them back. But no, when it comes to failure, I think to me, it's there's actually a really good book, and it's How to Think Like a Roman Emperor is what it's called. And it's about the studies of Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism and those sorts of things. And I think it's about trying to not be emotional in those failure settings. To really calculate what the situation is, remove yourself. So if you get a curveball in a meeting that you didn't see coming and it completely throws you through a loop, or a situation where it's just a no-win, I think the difference here is knowledge versus wisdom, and having the wisdom to know the difference between what you could control, what you couldn't control in those moments. And then being able to check your emotion, because we are emotional creatures. And I think that's the problem with loss, is you do things you regret when you're highly emotional. And so the more you can actually be more stoic and more introspective, also that humility of like, look, I know, like, the best baseball players in the world bat 400, right? All stars bat 400. So that tells me that, like, I'm not going to win everything. And what I'm telling my teams now, so we're actually changing the standard of care. So if you look at where I am and my perspective every day, we're actually changing the standard of care to where they're trying to drive. So 80% of diagnostic dilemmas can be solved with ultrasound at the bedside. And half the time you do it, it'll either change the diagnosis or the care pathway. That's powerful. Then why isn't everybody doing it? It's because it's hard. It's difficult. About half of all physicians can read an ultrasound in their specialty, but only less than 15% can actually acquire the image themselves. So to me, I care less about losing to a competitor or another player in the field, because ultimately, if I can grow the pie for my perspective, which is driving imaging at the bedside every time, I'm actually evangelical for ultrasound. Or even back in the day when we were in the EMR war, it was about getting people to an electronic record that was actually a clinically integrated record first and foremost, because my perspective is going to win, because every other system, with the exception of one other, didn't have a clinically integrated record, right? It was literally hodgepodge and it was halfway baked there. And so if you actually have that real perspective, your industry is going to grow. I feel like I'm a beacon of whatever industry or segment of the industry that I'm in. And I'm preaching that perspective, my perspective, obviously. And do I think I have the best hammer? Absolutely. But I also do believe that, like, growing that perspective is probably the most critical thing, and getting that to be a norm, from a novelty to a norm, is what I usually say. And by doing that, I get to set the tone most of the time, because every organization I've worked for has actually been a leader within that segment. And so my perspective is very valid, and it's probably, where we are today, we are the 800-pound gorilla in the room in the handheld ultrasound market. But if you actually look at us at the ultrasound industry, we're like, there's ultrasound, and then there's bedside ultrasound, and then there's 6 feet of crap, and then there's handheld. It's just not a blip on the radar. But what I need to be doing is evangelicalizing that, and then I'll never lose, because at the end of the day, I need that humility, that education to actually move it, and not to be angry about, oh, well, you're with this vendor today or you're doing that. You've actually bought into my vision of growing and driving, ultrasound in this perspective, because I believe in the clinical relevancy of it.
I mean, you're playing, you're playing the infinite game, right?
Yeah.
So if you follow like Simon Sinek, another good, just amazing author and thought leader, is play the infinite game. If you're playing the finite game, you're playing with scarcity, or you're rushing somebody to a decision, you're looking at a transactional relationship. What I'm hearing is you're playing the long game, the infinite game, and saying, this is about improving clinical care through bedside handheld ultrasound, right? And if people believe what you believe, right, that's the why. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like you are able to do that. How do you strike that balance when there are growth expectations upon all of us, especially in this industry? And like, we want to play the infinite game, but we also need to get business done. And we need to make our margins in order to achieve our missions. So what does that look like for you? And especially, like, have you run into situations where the growth expectations are here, reality's here? Like, how do you bridge that gap? How do you set those expectations with the board, leadership, whoever is setting that agenda?
Yeah. Well, and we're in such a nascent, I think if you look at early adopters to early majority, that magic number is somewhere between 16 and 18%. Like I said, about 15% of doctors. So we're right on the precipice of that inflection. The problem is you don't know when that inflection happens until you've actually hit the inflection point, right? And so
you look back and you go, oh, that was it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was it. And it's done. It's a very lagging indicator, but it is there. I think I've been at Butterfly 3.5 years, and we've been waiting for that inflection point. And I think I said it probably when I started, I was like, that inflection point probably will happen in the next 36 to 48 months. Well, we're about month 38 of it right now. It might be a smidge longer than that. It might be a smidge shorter when it actually comes and takes place. But no, I mean, I think that's part of and originally I wasn't in a position and we didn't have much data to go support it, because handheld was such a nascent market at that time to even put targets and what is that growth attribute, or what is the right metric to go guide towards. And so I think that's tough, right? Because if I'm looking forward, for me, it's also making sure that we're saying the right words around forecasting and what this is. I mean, I think when we talked about one of the things when I took over was standardization, because I was a regional director before I took over the business. And I was a fiefdom that was doing something different in the Northeast and the Southeast, and we all operated independently. And one of the first things we did, was actually getting those values in place. So we all kind of call accountability towards each other. But then the second thing was, what words are we using to say, line of sight is the different than forecast. So I might be forecasting 1,000 units for the quarter, right? But what I'm really saying is my current line of sight based on my current pipeline that I can actually see is 850. But here's my plan to bridge that extra 150 delta to be able to set the right expectations. Because ultimately, do I feel really confident in that 1,000? Yeah, I really do. But I need to be able to articulate to leadership that delta that's there that I have to work towards. It also, in our situation, we're really getting really good at finally figuring out forecasting, where if it's a large enough deal, we actually don't put it in our line of sight, because those sometimes are coin tosses. No matter how good you're positioned, one thing can happen and the whole thing can delay. And so how do you build a business based on routine, actual, real organic growth? And so when you talk about the infinite game, it's about building that core pipeline, because if you're going and meeting with all these people, you're eventually going to go from 1 unit deals, 2 unit deals to 50 to 20 to 60 to 70 to 100 unit deals. As a byproduct of that, it's going to become more systemic, but it is a ground game that you have to have on lock before you can actually really start taking those big swings. And so that's kind of where, and it's in this role, especially when I'm not directly touching the business anymore, right? Like I have a team, a layer between me. Like if I'm getting bad information, then I collate even worse information and then it doesn't go. And so that's been part of, I think, the journey as well, is being able to get everybody on the same page, be able to articulate, and then just make sure that we're telling a right story through multiple layers, and an accurate picture as to where we are at this time. And I think and sometimes that's just the best you can do.
Yeah. So Rhys, what I heard a couple of things in your description there. And one of the things that I heard is a very deliberate focus on terminology, on process, and on normalizing for what is repeatable versus what is unique, even if it's big or feels good, what have you. You talked about earlier when we started the discussion, in your current role, you've got leaders reporting up to you and they have teams underneath. I believe you talked about, you have client success, you have sales teams, et cetera, that all roll up into your organization. Talk a little bit around what are some of the mechanical things that you are seeing work across those teams. For example, you threw out some methodologies, consultative selling, blue sheet selling, et cetera. Do you all align around a methodology? What's working well on the sell side to go move things through your pipeline in an efficient process?
Yeah. So I think we have several people from several different backgrounds. So we actually have a hodgepodge of a sales force because we are a unique company in the fact that we are a device manufacturer. We're also a software component. So the one thing I didn't talk about is we actually have a really great middleware solution that can actually ingest any bedside ultrasound from any vendor and actually capture charges, auto-generate orders into the EMR, and be able to actually really capture the value of doing bedside ultrasound regardless of vendor. That's powerful, right? But those are two different types of cells. And then all the while, you're also trying to change anybody who's traditionally ultrasound thinks of cart and they think of those things. They don't think of handheld, because handheld has always been academic, right? It's a nice toy to have, but it's not been there. But like our latest generation has the same image quality. A $4,700 handheld has the same image quality as a $30,000 cart, right? So it's also getting them to change that type of mentality. So what those playbooks, but I think they're somewhere founded in somewhere between Trust Triangle and Blue Sheet, that we've all had experience. But really what we're doing right now is taking really the back half of the year to really come into terms and think about how do we get from here to there, because we know what we're currently doing today is going to perpetually grow at a good clip, but it's not going to be exponential and it's not going to make the impact to shift the market, which is what we need to have.
Obviously the goal is to create a predictable revenue stream, right? From a company perspective, so that, you can grow your valuation and all that stuff. Is there a move? Do you feel like that buyers are prepared to buy differently than they have in the past? So, right, the old way was you secure capital in the budget, right? For especially for equipment, it's more of a capital purchase. And obviously the market is, there's a physical asset, but there's the operating costs and the SaaS fees and all that go with it. Do you feel like the market is changing the way they buy? Have they changed, or still a ways to go?
So I'll answer both. I know that's not the right answer, but it is. So I think it's where you are. So like when I said earlier, rural healthcare is 10 years behind the healthcare market, writ large. The healthcare market's 10 years behind the rest of the market from everything else. So I think when we talk about health systems specifically, they're still very much in that capital procurement phase. Whereas what you're seeing more that are, obviously using that hardware plus subscription model, we've hacked off a few independent doctors, but for the most part, we still have the single highest selling handheld ultrasound in the history of the world, with our IQ Plus model, right? And that was a hardware plus software, subscriptions, kind of a SaaS bundled kind of thing. And so I think it just depends as to the malleability to it. And I think that's where the learnings and the ability to go, just because I have this novel technology that has a cloud that you can save images to our archive and do all this other stuff is great. But if all they're looking for is a device to pick up, and put on a patient and set down and not save the image and not get the billing, and they're not even thinking about that, be willing to meet them where they are. And I think that's the one probably thing I tell anybody who's in healthcare IT is just because you have a really cool hammer and you're not wrong with your thesis, if the market's not ready for it, if your individuals, like I said, novel technology doesn't mean novel new business case, and figure out ways to fit in today's. And then over time, once you become valuable, you can then pivot and transition and then establish your perspective and then be able to change business models. I mean, look at Apple. When you talk about Apple iTunes, they didn't start with a subscription-based model. No one would have done that. They started off where you buy $1 a song because you're used to buying $13 for an album, but you can buy just the songs you want. And then eventually people got tired of spending hundreds of dollars a year on buying individual songs, where I was like, well, what if I just charge you $5 a month and you can get all of them? Would you do that? Absolutely, I would do that, right? So I always say to make change and to really drive in a market, it's actually pain squared, which is the pain you know and the pain you don't, plus relief, plus easy, and that's how you get change. And like where we are as a company, and I think as a ultrasound POCUS, which is point of care ultrasound market, is they don't know the pain that they don't know yet, right? And so it's being able to highlight that and then be able to build your, I don't even call it ROI. I think it's just the value proposition, because it changes so many different things, not just financial, but also workflow, and then ultimately care across an entire organization.
So Rhys,
Doug, I want to flash that formula up on the screen. Are you already thinking that?
I think that's a great idea.
The pain squared formula. Let's make sure we add that.
Absolutely. Rhys, we've covered some phenomenal ground. There's much more I think we could dive into. I don't think I know. And in fact, it pains me that we're not going to spend 60 more minutes. It may not pain you, but it pains me because they're just any number of avenues I think that would be well worth continuing the discussion. But we're going to bring this to a close. James has a surprise question for you. And in fairness, I think this is a double whammy. So one, it's a little risque, no pun intended, maybe pun intended. And as an Oklahoma gentleman, it's going to be really fascinating to see how you answer this. So James.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you've traveled to Kansas City enough, so we'll do it. Maybe we'll give you two shots here. One is for your hometown and where you live now, and then answer it if you had a client coming to Kansas City. So let's do the Kansas City part first. You've got a big client coming to Kansas City, one chance to take them out for a meal, and all they tell you is, I just want that Kansas City barbecue. Give me some of that Kansas City barbecue. Where do you take them?
Well, I think I would actually, so anytime you get a question like that, or any question in sales, it's always clarification, right? So I would actually probably go back and clarify.
Time's up.
No, hold on. Do you want real? Do you want real silverware, or do you want plastic silverware?
Just give the answer.
Oh, I would take them to. I would probably, for a business meeting, I'd probably take them to Q39. Is probably what I would do.
All right, Q39. Good job.
All right, fantastic.
And then in your hometown, where you live, where would you take a client?
For barbecue, Kansas City. That's what I would do.
I love it.
You would actually drive them.
I would drive them up to Kansas City. No, actually, there
to Oklahoma Joe's.
No, yeah, to Oklahoma Joe's. No, there actually is. There's one barbecue place in town. So Oklahoma's unique because it's very more of a Texas style barbecue. So not the marriage of sauce and all that kind of stuff. So not and it's all beef. But there is one place called Clark Crew. It's actually right across the street from Baptist Integris, and it is awesome. They've actually competed. They have a lot of competitions. They've actually, I think, placed either high in the American Royal or have done those sorts of things. They have the burn ends. Very good barbecue. So there's the only place to eat barbecue in Oklahoma City is Clark Crew. Everywhere else is just a derivative of the Texas, experience.
We don't want to talk about Texas.
Take it away.
When we
just alienated all of our Texas listeners,
that's right.
By the way.
When we take this on the road,
comments about the Big 12 and everything else. So we're equal opportunity offenders.
We are.
We try to piss off as many people as we can with each podcast.
See, and
whittle down our audience.
Yeah, to focus our audience.
I'm such a Big 12 guy that I just graduated about 3 months ago with my master's, actually at the University of Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. Congratulations.
But I know that's painful to say.
It's fine. I have a really nice jacket that's red on the outside and has a picture of me as Pistol Pete on the inside, so it doesn't actually have to touch my skin. But one of the things I was proud of is I graduated in May, and it wasn't until June that they left the ACC. So both of my degrees are actually Big 12 degrees. So I can still proudly double down, regardless of the University of Oklahoma. So.
Timing is an important factor in all facets of life. So, Rhys, this has been a fantastic conversation. As I mentioned, any number of things that we could continue to dive into, but we've covered some phenomenal ground. Thank you so much for joining the Counterweight. Appreciate the conversation. It's been wonderful.
I appreciate the opportunity, guys. Awesome, have a great day.
Dude.
Thank you for listening. We are excited to bring new episodes out each week. We are incredibly grateful to our guests and our listeners. Let us know what you think by commenting on the episodes. We are proudly sponsored by the Upper Right Corner, which provides advice on strategic growth, including growth assessments and strategy, go-to-network planning, sales leadership and team coaching, and fractional leadership roles. For more, visit theupperrightcorner.com. Waypoint Healthcare Solutions is also proud to sponsor the Counterweight Podcast. Waypoint HCS is a focused consulting organization helping health systems, providers, and organizations to develop and implement patient engagement strategies. Waypoint HCS provides strategic consulting and patient engagement technology guidance and selection. Waypoint also helps support implementation and ongoing program management. For more, visit Waypoint HCS's LinkedIn page or waypointhcs.com. Thank you to our guests and our listeners. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Subscribe, like, and follow, and we look forward to joining you again next Wednesday for another episode of The Counterweight.